The first sound wasn't his voice, it was the crystal glass shattering against the fieldstone hearth. The wine, a vintage my husband Robert had bottled the year our son George was born, bled into the stone like a fresh wound. He hadn't come for a reconciliation. He'd come to collect. He slammed the door, and for 7 years the silence was absolute. No calls, no letters, nothing. Then at Robert's funeral, he materialized through the Oregon mist. Polished Italian shoes sinking into the damp soil, a suit so black it seemed to suck the light right out of the day, and in his hand, a sheaf of papers that declared his intention to cleave our life's work in two. I froze. But it wasn't from the shock of his demand. It was the chilling, hollow ache of recognition. In that instant, I understood that my identity as a mother had been a shroud I'd wrapped myself in. For so long I'd forgotten the woman who lived underneath. And yet, it was that profound betrayal that set me on a path I never could have foreseen. A journey back to the person I was before I ever answered to his name. I am Evelyn Vance. I am 68 years old, and my bones are fused to this land. 800 acres of gnarled vines, rolling hills shrouded in fog, and a silence so deep it has its own weight. We call it Sorrow Vine Crest. Tourists who wind their way up the mountain pass see the rows of Pinot Noir clinging to the slopes and call it beautiful. But I have learned that beauty is often just resilience made visible. My husband Robert and we sculpted this place from bedrock and pure American grit. We arrived as kids with nothing but a rusted-out Ford pickup and a box of fragile experimental grape-cutting suits in Napa said would never survive a harsh Cascade winter. While our friends went on all-inclusive cruises, we dug irrigation ditches until our hands were raw and bleeding. While they bought McMansions in the suburbs, we mortgaged our future on a prayer and a weather report, watching the sky for the killer frost that could wipe us out in a single night. Over 45 years, this vineyard became more than our home. It was the tangible evidence of a shared vow. Proof that two people with enough guts could coax life from unforgiving earth and leave behind a story worth telling. We had one son, George. He grew up with the scent of fermented grapes in his hair and the reddish-purple stains of harvest on his clothes. He used to tear through the vine rows, his laughter echoing against the mountainside. A little king in his wild domain. I was so certain he loved this place, that its roots were tangled with his own. I believed he would be the one to carry its legacy forward when our hands grew tired. But a person's heart is its own uncharted territory. In his teens, the vineyard became a chore, then a burden. He started calling it your project, like he was just some long-term guest. The city beckoned with its promises of fast money and an existence unburdened by seasons and soil. He left for Portland on a partial business scholarship and never looked back. Treated this land not as a cradle, but as a cage he'd finally escaped. Robert, ever the optimist, would say, "Let him go, Evelyn, he needs to find his own way. The vines will call him home." For years, I clung to that hope like a vine to a trellis. I kept his room pristine, his favorite coffee going stale in the pantry. I'd reread his last text message, a terse, loveless sign-off, searching for a hidden warmth that wasn't there. Robert processed his grief differently. He retreated further into the quiet hum of the winery. Some nights, I'd find him in the barrel room, his hand resting on a cask, whispering to the darkness. The unspoken grief between us grew heavier than any harvest. Then came the night that shattered everything. The night the slap of his palm against my face was replaced by the crash of breaking glass. It was a frigid Tuesday in November. The wind was howling down from the mountains. Robert and I were sharing a quiet dinner, the comfortable silence of a long marriage filling the space between us. Then we heard it, an engine, too loud, too aggressive for our gravel road. I knew that sound. 7 years couldn't erase the arrogant growl of his Audi. He burst through the door without knocking. His face was pale and tight, his eyes burning with a feverish desperation. He looked older, thinner, wearing a designer suit that looked alien in our rustic home. He ignored me completely, his gaze locked on Robert. "We need to talk business." His voice was strained. He tossed a glossy folder onto our worn oak table. It slid right next to Robert's plate. Inside were proposals from a group of venture capitalists. They wanted to buy the lower 40 acres to develop into some luxury wellness retreat. The price was obscene. George launched into a frantic monologue about his failed startup in Seattle. The debts piling up, the life he was supposed to have. He needed this deal. "Besides," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "what do 2 old people need with all this land? It's a waste." I told him we weren't selling. I tried to explain that the land wasn't a commodity. It was our history. our soul. I said we would help him find another way, but this was a desecration. That's when the rage boiled over. He accused me of always coddling him, then of siding with his father, of hoarding a future he believed was his birthright. His hands were trembling. That's when he grabbed the wine glass from the table, the one from the 1995 vintage, the year of his birth, and hurled it into the fireplace. It exploded against the stone. Red wine, dark as blood, splattered across the hearth. Robert rose from his chair, his movements slow but absolute. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood between us, a silent, immovable wall. He looked at George, his expression one of profound, bottomless sorrow, and said 2 words, "Get out." George didn't fight. The rage seemed to drain from him, leaving behind something hollow and defeated. He turned and walked out. The sound of his engine tore through the night until it was swallowed by the storm. Robert didn't speak. He just knelt and began picking up the larger shards of glass, his calloused fingers careful around the sharp edges. I brought a wet cloth to wipe the wine from the stone, but the stain remained, a dark reminder of a wound that would never fully heal. I stood beside the grave, clutching the letter Robert had left for me in his bedside drawer. My hand was surprisingly steady. The service was nearly over when the sound of tires on wet gravel cut through the pastor's final prayer. A menacingly sleek black sedan, the kind you see in movies, slid to a stop. The door opened and George emerged, a vulture in a bespoke suit. He wasn't alone. A woman, sharp and severe, followed him, and behind her, a guy in a rumpled suit carrying a leather briefcase. George moved through our small gathering of mourners, not with deference, but with an unnerving sense of purpose. He waited for the final amen. Then he stepped forward, right to the edge of his father's grave. He didn't touch the casket. He didn't offer a word. He turned to me, his eyes as cold and flat as river stones, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't the greeting of a son to his grieving mother. It was the signal of a predator to its prey. The man with the briefcase stepped forward and handed me a thick envelope. It wasn't a condolence card, it was a legal filing. George was contesting the estate. He was demanding a 50% stake in the land, the winery, the equipment, the entire inventory of aged wine, our life savings aging in oak barrels. He claimed that as the sole heir, he was legally entitled to half. I felt nothing. It was as if the cold drizzle had seeped into my bones and frozen my soul. Our old family lawyer, Arthur, a man who'd known us for 30 years, poured me a cup of strong black coffee and let the silence sit between us. "When did Robert update the will?" he finally asked. I told him the truth. 2 years ago, after the first heart attack. He'd written it by hand. We'd had it notarized. It was in the fireproof safe. Arthur let out a long, slow breath. "That's good, Evelyn. That's very good." But he explained George could still drag this through the courts for years. It would get ugly, public, and astronomically expensive. He'd bleed me dry trying to get what he wanted. Driving home through the thick evening fog, my headlights cutting ghostly tunnels through the mist, I felt a cold resolve solidify within me. Back at the house, I opened the safe. There it was, Robert's familiar, steady script filling the page. He left everything to me, every vine, every bottle, every debt. George's name was not mentioned, not once. I didn't feel relief holding that paper. I felt a profound hollowness. This was not how I had envisioned protecting our legacy. In a drawer beneath the safe, my hand found something I hadn't touched in years. My journals, page after page of notes on the vineyard, and one entry in particular, written the night he threw the glass. I had documented everything, the sound of the shatter, the look in his eyes, the smell of the wine soaking into the stone. I had documented the death of Hope that night. I made a copy of the will. I scanned the journal page. I sealed them in an envelope for Arthur. If George wanted a war, he would find me prepared. This wasn't about a grieving mother anymore. This was about the woman who had built an empire from dirt and was not about to let it be dismantled by the son who saw it only for its price tag. The official notice of proceedings arrived a week later. Seeing that court date printed in stark black and white, it felt like the start of a final countdown. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The vineyard wasn't just land. It was my body's autobiography. Every scar on my hands from the trellising wire, every ache in my back from 1,000 harvests. It had raised me as much as I had raised it. I knew then I wasn't just defending it from George. I was reclaiming it for myself. The next morning, I made a call I hadn't made in a decade to Sofia Petrova. She'd worked a harvest with us in her youth before moving to Seattle and starting a consulting firm that helped small farms navigate legacy planning. I told her everything: the lawsuit, the will, the soul-crushing ache of fighting my own son. She listened without interruption, and then she asked a question that changed everything. "Evelyn," she said, "have you ever considered putting the vineyard into a conservation trust? A legacy trust. It would legally remove the vineyard from the realm of private inheritance. It wouldn't be my property anymore. It would belong to a mission, to the story." It was the ultimate power move. It was about standing for something that could not be bought or sold. The legal transfer to the Robert Vance Legacy Trust took 3 weeks of quiet, furious work. I moved with a singular focus, my grief channeled into a powerful current of purpose. By the time the court date arrived, Sorrowvine Crest was no longer my property. It belonged to a promise. I walked into that sterile, soulless courtroom. George was already there, his face a mask of detached confidence. His lawyer laid out his claim of birthright and entitlement, painting George as a wronged son seeking his fair share. I felt a strange sense of calm. Then Arthur stood. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply presented the judge with the notarized will and the official certificate of the land trust. He explained in calm, measured tones that the asset in question no longer existed in a form that could be claimed. The judge reviewed the documents. George's lawyer started stammering, and for the first time, George looked at me. The mask cracked. Beneath it was not anger, but sheer, uncomprehending shock. He had expected tears, a bitter fight, a negotiation. He had never, ever imagined I would simply burn the map. We left the courthouse without a word. Arthur walked me to my truck. It wasn't a celebration. It was an acknowledgement of a war ended and a life irrevocably changed. That night, I slept with the windows open for the first time since Robert died. The wind moved through the house, and it felt not like a haunting, but a cleansing. 2 weeks later, an envelope was tucked into my screen door. No stamp. George's slanted, rushed handwriting. It wasn't an apology. It was a tirade of shock and fury. He said I had stolen his future, that Robert would have never wanted this. He admitted he'd taken out a massive loan against his expected inheritance and was now facing financial ruin. I had, he wrote, burned the last bridge between us. I read the letter, folded it, and felt nothing. The anger was his to carry. The trust began to breathe life back into the vineyard. Students from the local community college started weekend internships. Sophia helped me organize workshops. One day, she asked if I'd give a talk on cold, hardy varietals. I stood before a small group in the barn, my voice shaky at first, and I spoke about the vines. And as I spoke, I felt a part of myself, dormant for years, begin to stir. It was late November when he knocked on the door. It was George. He looked haggard, his expensive suit replaced by a worn jacket. He stood on the porch, his shoulders slumped, unable to meet my eye. He told me he was dropping the appeal. He'd lost everything. He was broke. He asked, his voice barely a whisper, if there was any work, anything at all. I thought of the shattered glass, the lawsuit, the years of silence. But I also saw the ghost of the boy who loved this land. I told him a row of fence posts needed replacing before the ground froze. He just nodded and walked toward the barn. He started showing up, doing the hard, thankless jobs without a word. He turned the compost, cleaned the gutters, sharpened the tools. One evening, he asked me about his father's last days. It was the first time he'd said his name. I told him the truth, that it was peaceful, that he died here, on his land, as he'd wished. A few days later, a package arrived. A rare book on viticulture Robert had always wanted. Tucked inside was a note. I remembered. We never spoke of it, but he started staying a little later. I saw him showing a young volunteer how to properly prune a dormant vine, his voice low and patient. There was no grand reunion, no tearful moment of forgiveness. But one night, he stayed for dinner. We ate in silence, the quiet ticking of the old clock filling the space. It wasn't closure. It was something more fragile, and perhaps more real. It was a beginning. I had learned that some things, when they are shattered, cannot be repaired, but they can be repurposed. The land was safe. Its story would continue, tended by new hands and by old hands finding their way back. And I, its guardian, had finally found my peace, not in holding on, but in transforming what was broken into something that could, once again, grow. This story wasn't easy to tell. It's the hardest thing I've ever lived through, but I shared it because I know some of you are fighting your own battles. Maybe not over land, but over your peace, your family, your legacy. Don't let anyone steal your story without a fight. hit that subscribe button right now. Because this channel is about finding the strength to protect what's yours. If you don't, you might miss the exact strategy you need to save everything you've built. I put out videos every day about resilience, legacy, and finding your power. If you got anything from my story today,